Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Well, today, the Ukrainian military has declared it has seized control of another town that was under the control of Russian forces. Now, we've heard that they've called this a town, they've called it a settlement, they've called it a village, but I wanted to give you, the viewer, an opportunity to see exactly the area in question. And we're going to scroll right down here into this area, and this is it. Rivnopil. Rivnopil? Am I saying that right? Maybe, maybe not. So essentially what you have is a tree line, and then open fields to the north and to the south, and then possibly something here. I'm not sure what that would be, but probably a couple of houses, maybe a farmstead. Difficult to say, but that is the area in question that the Ukrainians have allegedly taking control over. Now, when I say taking control over, we have seen the Ukrainians using this tactic of running in with very light forces, Humvees. They then hang the Ukrainian flag on a structure and then beat feet back north. And that is the Ukrainian way of saying that they have taken control of another town or settlement. And I think, unfortunately, what they're having to do is to try and articulate or prove some sort of success, meaning that this offensive operation that the Ukrainians launched at the beginning of June is still continuing. And at this point, we don't believe it is here at MFAN. We do not believe the Ukrainian offensive is continuing on the size and scope and magnitude that it started in the early middle part of June. We believe the Ukrainian forces have taken quite a few casualties. They've hit the pause button, and they're right now reassessing the situation, meaning they, the Ukrainians, the powers that be, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, I think, are coming to the understanding that this is going to be a very difficult proposition for the Ukrainians, for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to continue with this offensive without air power. Now, I had made a comment in the previous video in which I had stated that the Russians were firing 500 artillery rounds towards the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians would answer with 5 to 20. I was repeating an anecdotal report from actual Ukrainian soldiers. And in this specific interaction, this Ukrainian soldier had, and I didn't talk about the other stuff that this Ukrainian soldier had said as well. And part of that statement that I repeated was that he stated that the Ukrainians fire 5 and then the Russians fire 500. Now, obviously, is that completely accurate? No, probably not. But that's his perception. That is the perception of some of these Ukrainian soldiers. And another thing that he said as well, and the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian state, Western media, have done a very good job of not letting this information out. Another thing that he said, that he believes that an entire generation, the entire fighting age generation of Ukrainian men, ages 18 to mid-20s, are just getting wiped out. It'll be a war of old men and young kids as it continues, if it continues in the way it is continuing, the way the fighting is happening right now. And that individual Ukrainian soldier had talked about he was the survivor of an artillery attack in which 5 of his fellow service members were killed in said attack. And he was originally fighting in and around Bakhmut And he was also asked if he would go back to Bakhmut, and he said no, he would not go. He would not do it. He felt unsupported, and the casualties that are being taken are very, very heavy. And we've heard this from time and time again from the Ukrainian side. But again, it's very difficult to get that information and report on what is accurately happening on the front lines. Are the Russians taking casualties? Absolutely. But right now, because the Ukrainians went on this offensive, they're experiencing something a little different that the Ukrainians, have not experienced prior in this conflict. They're facing a dug-in enemy that has prepared defensive lines, that is also using a lot of artillery and a lot of air power. And again, as I've talked about before, some of that air power, which the Russians had backed off in terms of using behind Ukrainian lines, namely the K-52 attack helicopter. We're now seeing that being deployed against the Ukrainians, and that was one of the key systems that that disallowed this Ukrainian offensive to proceed further south towards the main Russian defensive line. So again, the Ukrainians have quite a bit of open fields to cover before they even get to the main Russian defensive line. So you have these areas here that the Ukrainians claim that they have taken. These blue areas, this was the offensive. So not a lot of territory, essentially open fields, and this Makarivka is probably the largest settlement that they've taken. Essentially 3 roads go through the town with a couple of dozen houses. It's a village, and that's it. And to go further north is a dozen kilometers of open land, and then finally you get to the main Russian line. And then behind that you have secondary Russian lines as well. But very, very difficult proposition for the Ukrainians to continue this offensive without any form of air power. Like, HIMARS is not air power. It's effective, and that system has been reduced in capability because of Russian electronic warfare capability. But nonetheless, again, the offensive has not gone well. Lots of casualties for the Ukrainians, and I think right now the Ukrainians, and again its Western handlers, are reassessing this operation and what things look like in the future, and how would they proceed. How would the Ukrainians proceed with offensive operations? And they may not be able to, again, without an air force. So then is the West going to give the Ukrainians an air force? Hard to say at this moment. Difficult to say. So I think the West has 2 options right now. NATO has 2 options. Do we look at a frozen conflict? Because again, very difficult for the Ukrainians to proceed with large-scale offensive operations without direct air support. Or B, does NATO hand over F-16s, train the Ukrainians in the use of F-16s or Saab Gripens or what have you, and risk further escalation of the conflict? So I think those are the 2 choices right now we're looking at in the West. The other issue I want to talk about today is the possible expansion of the Russian National Guard, the Rosguardia. That is the parallel force, parallel to the Russian ground forces. Again, this is not a force that looks like the U.S. National Guard. It is a federal entity directly reporting to the office of the president, Vladimir Putin. Some folks would call it a presidential guard force. Now, the FSO is the actual presidential guard force. That's another force completely different. But the National Guard also has that capability. And the National Guard, the Russian National Guard, would have been used in this Wagner mutiny. One of the key forces that would have protected Moscow was the 1st Operational Division, ODON, of the Russian National Guard. Zolotov, the head of the Russian National Guard, has made the statement within the last 24 hours that because the Wagner forces had tanks and heavy equipment, while as the Russian National Guard did not, that the Russian National Guard would in the future be taking on heavy weapons, meaning they would have tanks and armored fighting vehicles. Well, they have BTR-80s and some armored fighting vehicles, but I'm talking about BMP-2s and T-80s, T-90s, T-72 tanks. And it looks like the Russian National Guard will now be equipped with heavy equipment because of what happened with that Wagner mutiny. Now, again, I contend that Moscow was never under real threat. I think the purpose of Prigozhin's operation was not to seize Moscow. He did not militarily seize Rostov-on-the-Don. There was no battle for that city, okay? It was a movement of forces north. Now, if he would have gotten closer to Moscow, obviously the Russian Air Force would have been deployed as it had been deployed earlier against those Wagner forces. And it would have been very, very difficult, if you look at it from a military perspective, for this essentially very small force of Wagner forces to have taken Moscow, especially with the forces that are present in Moscow. Massive National Guard presence. Now, obviously, they didn't have tanks, but they would have been equipped with anti-tank guided weapon systems, and they would have direct support from the Russian Air Force. But I don't believe the Wagner forces would have gotten to Moscow. I think the Russian Air Force would have stopped them before they were within sight of Moscow. And there were other forces as well. There were regular Russian Army forces, Spetsnaz forces, Special Operation Command forces are located in Moscow. You have the FSO, you have FSB, Special Operations Forces. There's a wide array of forces that were in Moscow and around Moscow that would have made it almost mission impossible for those Wagner forces. So I don't think that was the intent. And I think the Wagner entity at the time knew that taking Moscow was really off the cards. It was just something that would have been mission impossible. And again, this was more about a statement. This was a message. This was a message to the Kremlin. This was a message to Vladimir Putin, Shoigu, and Gerasimov. I don't think this was a serious military effort to seize Moscow. And again, I don't believe that Wagner seized Rostov-on-the-Don. Were they in Rostov-on-the-Don? Yeah, they were. But at that point, the Russian military had made no effort to stop the movement of Wagner forces. Once we finally got word that the Russian military had been ordered to stop the movement of Wagner forces, we did see some sporadic fighting. We did see Russian helicopter gunships attacking Wagner forces. We did see Wagner forces shoot down a few Russian helicopters. And you could see the Russians were very much intending to eliminate the ability of the Wagner forces to supply itself in the field. They were destroying fuel depots. They were going after fuel supplies of Wagner forces. So outside of a very short, violent campaign to get into Moscow to do who knows what, it just would have been unsuccessful. Now, some people have other views on that, and that's fine. I get it. But does this mean that the Russian military is weak? Does this mean the political leadership at the Kremlin is weak? I would say no at this point. I think people are overreacting to what occurred with Wagner. Again, this was not a NATO force that had entered Russia proper. This was a Russian force that was already in Russia and was moving around. It's a lot different. So it's difficult to compare and contrast a NATO hostile Ukrainian force trying to enter Russia versus a Russian force that's already in Russia moving around until it was declared hostile. And then we saw what happened. Very quickly, within hours, that force decided that it was not possible to continue north. And now here we are. But again, we're going to continue to watch the situation, report on the situation, and bring you more content for your consumption. Thank you for joining us today. And as always, have a good day.